She was standing out in the snow, wearing nothing but her thin underlayers, and the lawman forced her to do it in front of everyone. Folks in Red Valley would talk for decades about that Christmas morning. The sun rested low enough to shine across the frosted dirt, but the cold felt like a blade sliding straight into the bones. And right there in the center of the street stood Mira Lane, barefoot in the snow, shivering so violently her teeth knocked together. Her coat had been pulled off her shoulders, her dress forced open down the front, her skin turning the color of old parchment. Most men in town turned away. Some pretended they did not notice anything. People in Red Valley had learned the tough way to stay quiet. 3 folks who once pushed back against the sheriff had vanished without a sound, and nobody dared ask what happened to them. But everyone heard Sheriff Brant Harlow barking at her, telling her to remove one layer after another, while accusing her of taking the church offerings. His voice carried across the square, rough and sharp, like he took pleasure in every second of humiliating her. Mira tried to fold her arms across her chest, but one of his guards yanked them down. Snowflakes melted on her skin like tiny burns, and the worst part was the silence. That kind of silence that says nobody is going to step in, nobody is willing to risk going against the badge. A young woman standing there half-clothed in the winter cold and not a single soul brave enough to pull her out of it. Well, almost no one. Jonas Red, who had been tying his horse beside the old cedar stump, heard the shouting and stopped. 50 years old, iron-gray beard, hands rough as old fence rails, a man who looked like he had already lived 3 lifetimes out on the frontier. He turned when Mira's voice cracked, and something in the sound of it made him stop breathing. He walked closer, slow, steady, like a man making a choice that could not be undone. And what he saw hit him harder than any winter squall. Mira stood there, trembling, her bare feet pressed into the snow, her breath thin and white, her eyes filled with panic. She looked like someone who had already lost too much in life to lose this too. Jonas locked eyes with the sheriff. No words, just that long stare older men give when they're done watching unfairness go unanswered. Then he shrugged off his heavy trail coat and wrapped it around Mira's shoulders, before the sheriff could speak. The whole street froze. Harlow's jaw twisted in fury. The townsfolk stared like they were watching a fuse burn toward a stick of dynamite. Mira lowered her head into the coat, shaking, clinging to whatever dignity she had left. Jonas stood right beside her, jaw tight, boots planted deep in the snow, as if daring any man to try and rip the coat off again. But here's what most folks never knew. Helping the girl was the easy part. What came afterward would drag Jonas into the darkest trouble of his life, and it would force Mira to confront the one truth she had spent years trying to bury. So here's the question. How do you protect someone who's already been broken twice before the law even steps in? Jonas didn't speak as he guided Mira away from that frozen street. She walked slowly, trying to keep his heavy coat pulled tight, her bare feet sinking into the thin layer of snow with every step. The townsfolk watched like they wished they could help, but they were too scared of the badge gleaming on Sheriff Harlow's chest. And maybe that was when Mira realized something painful. Fear ruled this place more than any law ever did. Jonas lifted her onto his horse with a gentleness no one expected from a man with hands as hardened as his. She held the coat shut with one hand and the saddle horn with the other, trying not to cry, but the cold had already forced tears from her eyes. Jonas climbed up behind her and rode toward the river, away from the noise, away from the shame still hanging over the storefronts. The red homestead sat beside an old cedar tree that had survived more winters than any person in Red Valley. Snow blanketed the ground, but the afternoon sunlight cast a soft gold across everything it touched, the way it sometimes does before dusk in the hills. Jonas helped Mira down and caught her when her knees weakened. She whispered an apology, but he shook his head. He told her she had nothing to be sorry for. Inside the warm barn, Mira finally let out a breath she had been holding for hours. Jonas built a fire in the small stove and handed her a pair of wool socks from his supplies. She hesitated, embarrassed, but he simply stepped back and said she could take her time. For the first time all day, her shoulders loosened. When she spoke, her voice cracked like old wood under strain. She told him she hadn't taken anything, and Jonas said he already believed her. He told her a man doesn't force a woman to strip down in the snow unless he's hiding something. And there it was, her first spark of hope in months, maybe years. Jonas poured warm water from a kettle and asked if Mira had anyone in town who could stand up for her. She lowered her eyes and shook her head. She said folks kept away because the sheriff had long ago decided she was trouble. And trouble was something no one wanted near them. Jonas leaned back, thinking hard. His jaw set the way men set it when they make a promise they intend to keep. He told her he was going to look into Harlow himself. Mira froze. She had seen men stand against the sheriff before. None had won. But Jonas looked like someone who had already survived too much to fear one crooked badge. What she didn't know yet was this. Jonas was about to uncover something far uglier than she ever imagined. And once he did, there would be no turning back for either of them. So here's the question. What exactly was Sheriff Harlow hiding that he was willing to shame a woman in the snow just to bury it? Jonas began digging over the next several days, riding into town at dawn and returning to the homestead long after nightfall. He wasn't a man of many words, but when something was wrong, he moved with purpose. Mira stayed at the ranch, warming her hands by the little stove, still wrapped in his oversized coat like it was the only shield she had left. Every time the wind nudged the door, she flinched, afraid the sheriff had come to finish what he started. Jonas told her she was safe, but fear sticks longer than any winter chill. Jonas headed straight into town. He went to the church first and spoke with the old pastor, who always smelled of old pipe smoke. The pastor admitted the stolen offering money had been kept in a locked box in his office. And here was the strange part. Sheriff Harlow was the only person with a key. He insisted on it after a security scare. That was the first crack. Next, Jonas visited the general store. The clerk grew pale the moment Jonas mentioned the sheriff. He said Harlow had bought a brand new rifle the week before and paid entirely in cash. Too much cash for a man whose wages barely fed his whiskey habit. The clerk whispered the rest, checking the windows every few seconds. He said the sheriff had been meeting a small crew out near the old rail yard, men known for cattle theft and robbing travelers. That was the second crack. Later that night, as Jonas rode along the frosted trail, two of the sheriff's men stepped out behind the pines. They tried to corner him, but Jonas drove his horse through the snow fast enough to slip past their reach. That was when he knew the sheriff had something worth killing for. And once a story begins to crack, the truth always squeezes its way through. Jonas walked back through the square, snow crunching beneath his boots, thinking about what he had learned. It all fit too neatly. Harlow staged the theft, pinned it on Mira, and used the town's fear to stop anyone from digging deeper. Jonas knew men like that. He'd met them during his cavalry years. Bullies hiding behind badges, hoping no courageous soul would stand long enough to pull the mask off. When Jonas returned to the homestead, Mira saw the look in his eyes and knew he had uncovered something dangerous. He told her everything, every detail, every new crack in the sheriff's lies. Her eyes filled with something new, a blend of fear and fury, the kind that makes someone decide they're done running. Jonas said the truth needed to come out, and she could help him bring it into the light. He warned her it would take time, maybe days, because the sheriff's loyal men watched every corner of town. Her hands trembled, but she nodded. She was ready, at last. Before we continue this journey, if you're feeling the story so far, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter ahead.
And hey, while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? The hearing was set for the next morning, scheduled with the traveling judge's visit. Not in a real courthouse, Red Valley didn't have one, but inside the old saloon that smelled of whiskey and pine soap. Jonas brought Mira early before the crowd arrived, and she stood with her hands clasped tight, staring at the empty chairs. Her breath quivered. She had already been humiliated once in front of this town, and now she was about to face them again. Jonas touched her shoulder and told her she didn't have to fear them anymore, and she believed him, enough to stay standing. By the time the judge arrived for the winter hearing, half the town had filled the room. A U.S. Marshal rode in with him to keep order. Men leaned on their knees, women clung to shawls, everyone whispered like they knew something big was about to burst open. Sheriff Harlow walked in last. His boot struck the floor with that sharp sound men use when they want everyone to remember who they think they are. He cast Mira a smug grin, the kind that said he believed he had already won. Jonah saw it and his jaw tightened. He sat close beside Mira, letting her feel his steady breathing. It kept her from shaking. The judge began with the dull tone only federal men have, but things heated quickly. Jonah stood first and laid out everything he had discovered: the missing donation money, the locked box, the rifle that cost far more than a sheriff's wages, the secret meetings near the rail yard. Every detail, every widening crack in the story. The saloon grew so quiet you could hear the fire snap in the stove.
Then came the moment no one predicted. Mira stepped forward herself. Her voice was soft, but steady as she told the judge and marshal exactly what happened on Christmas morning. How the sheriff forced her to remove her coat before the whole town. How he searched her as though she were nothing. How he used shame as a weapon. Some women covered their mouths. Some men lowered their eyes. Harlow tried to interrupt, but the marshal shut him down fast. Then the store clerk stepped forward and testified about the cash. Then the pastor spoke about the key. Piece by piece, the truth rose like a storm ready to break over the sheriff's head. Harlow's face shifted from smug to pale. He knew he was sinking, but he wasn't the type to go down quiet. And what he did next threw the whole room into chaos. So here's the question. What does a desperate sheriff do when his own lies corner him in front of everyone? When Sheriff Harlow realized the room had turned on him, something wild flickered in his eyes. He reached for the pistol on his hip, desperate, cornered, the way dangerous men often get when the truth finally catches up. But he wasn't fast enough. The U.S. Marshal already had his gun drawn, and the click of the hammer froze the room. Harlow hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. Just like that, the most feared man in Red Valley stood exposed. Not as a sheriff, not as a leader, but a liar who used power to crush the innocent. The marshal ordered deputies to cuff him and drag him out through the swinging saloon doors. The townsfolk parted like a river bending around a fallen tree. No cheering, no shouting, just that quiet relief that settles when justice finally replaces fear. Mira stood still, not shaking now, just breathing slow, even breaths. For the first time in ages, she wasn't hiding behind her hair or crossing her arms across her chest. She stood tall. She stood whole. Jonas stepped beside her and nodded like he knew she had reclaimed something far more important than her reputation. She had reclaimed herself. Words spread across the Wyoming territory by nightfall. The sheriff who humiliated a young woman on Christmas now sat behind federal bars in Cheyenne awaiting trial. Red Valley changed after that. People walked gentler, spoke softer, and looked Mira in the eyes with respect, something she had nearly forgotten. Mira moved into a small cabin near the Red Ranch where she helped tend horses and kept the church ledger. She laughed more. She held her head higher. And Jonas, well, he visited more than he ever admitted, not to rescue her anymore, but to walk beside her,
Two quiet souls learning that healing doesn't come from forgetting, but from choosing who you become afterward. When spring arrived, the old cedar near the homestead filled the air with pale blossoms drifting like soft snow. Mira and Jonas often sat beneath that tree at dusk, not talking much, just letting the quiet hold them. Sometimes healing needs nothing more than a place where the world finally stops hurting. Here's what most learned from Mira's journey. Sometimes life pushes you so far down you wonder if you'll ever stand again. But strength isn't something you wait for. It's something you decide. And courage often begins the moment you realize you deserve better, no matter who made you feel small. So tell me, if you had been there that day, would you have stepped forward like Jonas did? And in your own life, what truth are you ready to stand up for today? If this story gave you even a bit of strength or peace, please hit like, subscribe, and share the video so these Wild West stories can reach more hearts. Now tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what's the time on your side of the world right now?